Following up from last week's episode, we are taking a look at the role and image of Buddhism in Korea in paranormal context. If you missed the last episode, I'll leave the link in the description below and at the corner of the screen now. One thing I missed in the last week's introduction was, in some rare cases, some monks choose the path to escape the shaman's destiny. As I explained in past episodes about shamanism, most notably in episode 84, you do not choose to become a shaman. It's the shamanic gods that choose you to become a shaman for them. These gods can be pretty brutal. If you fight their call, they may bring you all sorts of misfortune till you bend. One way to escape the fate is by dedicating yourself to a religion with a greater authority, such as Buddhism, for example. One of today's stories follow exactly such a case. Another aspect, which you might have already noticed from last episode, is Buddhist temple sometimes serves as a shelter and a haven for those who need to get away from the world for a while. Whether you are a patient who needs a rehab, somebody with a task to really focus on away from distractions, or a person who fell into a hard time and could find nowhere else to turn to, Buddhist temples, a strict but simple routine, simple food, and quiet location can offer an ideal retreat. Even though, if today's stories be true, not everybody seems to find the peace there as they hoped for. So, here are 4 allegedly true stories from Korea about Buddhist monks and temples in paranormal context. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by host, Anthony. "16 years ago, he was just an ordinary man running a small restaurant. Business wasn't as lucrative as to be sustainable, and he ended up putting the restaurant for sale. But even then, it failed to attract many potential buyers. Seeing him distressed, his friend referred him to a shaman. 'Just in case, nothing to lose,' friend said, and he sought the shaman.
'I need to sell this shop quickly so that I can move on to the next business venture, but it's not going as smoothly as I hoped. I'm seeking your insight and advice,'
he said to the shaman.
'I see. Well, next week I'm going up in a mountain to pray. Why don't you come with me and pray next to me for 3 days?'
Shaman said. It wasn't what he expected, but he was desperate enough to accept the invitation. So they went up to a rock cave in a mountain, apparently a famous spot for shamans to come and offer prey. Not knowing anything better, he just prayed and prayed earnestly. On the second day, the shaman sent him off on an errand to go down and buy some rice. Halfway up carrying the heavy sack of rice, he ran into the shaman and her assistant coming down.
'Why are you coming down?'
he said. But the shaman didn't reply, but just pointed a big rock on the cliff.
'Do you see that?'
'You mean the rock? Yes.'
'What's on the rock?'
'What's... just a rock. What else?'
'Focus! Look at it! I mean, really, look at it!'
He didn't understand what it was all about, but stared at the rock nonetheless. He didn't know for how long, but suddenly...
Oh, I see.
'What do you see?'
'I see Buddha himself.'
He couldn't understand what was going on, but couldn't deny what he was seeing. An image of Buddha sitting on the big rock.
'See, I thought so.'
'What's happening?'
he asked, but the shaman grinned and just said,
"Calm down. I'll tell you what to do."
Evening came, and the shaman finally gave him the next task.
"Remember the big rock earlier? Go there."
To the rock? What for?
"Just do as I tell you."
He grumbled, but took his way to the rock anyway. It was well out of the beaten path, and he had to take every step slowly and carefully. When he reached the rock, he found an opening to a tiny hole, enough space for a little kid could barely crawl into. He looked inside, and there was a statue of Buddha about half a meter tall. He returned to the shaman to report what he found.
Under the rock was a statue of Buddha.
"Right. That's what you saw, isn't it?"
What's going on?
"Nothing. It just means you are destined to become a shaman."
He jumped, of course. It was nothing he had ever anticipated, nor would have ever wanted. He ran away and tried to deny what shaman said for days. But it seemed the experience at the mountain had already opened his third eye, and he saw what he was not supposed to see all around now. In the end, he sought the shaman again.
I'd rather die than become a shaman.
"The only other option is becoming a monk,"
was shaman's reply. So he gave up every worldly thing and became a Buddhist monk. And yet the instinct of powerful insight was too strong to ignore, so he left the temple in the mountain and now lives among ordinary people to hear their troubles and give them advices. And that's how I got to meet him and hear his story. This is what my grandma experienced. After separating from grandfather, Grandma and Mom, who was still but a little girl, had no other option but to stay with her mother, my great-grandmother. Great-grandma had long been a widow and lived in a Buddhist temple in Gyeonggi province. By now it's changed a lot, with the whole surrounding area developed into a leisure area, but back then the temple had somewhat otherworldly character out in the nature. Great-grandma wasn't encouraging the move initially, saying where the temple located behind the peaceful first impression was actually harsh energy, and people couldn't stand staying there for a long term unless they naturally had strong energy themselves. I don't know if it's really true or not, but often Buddhist temples were deliberately built on spots where there were lots of bad energy accumulated or where feng shui would define as a bad plot. The idea was that the grace of Buddha and the power of faith from monks and visitors can soften and filter out the bad energy. But anyway, Grandma had no other places to go with her little girl and moved into the temple despite of it all. At first, she had no big issues. Until, since when, she started suffering night terrors. Not only her body would seize up, but sometimes she felt her whole body levitating. And one day, Great-grandma took little Mom to visit a relative in Seoul for one night, leaving Grandma alone. Night fell, and Grandma went to bed as usual. But she was woken up by the creaking of the old wooden door. Grandma just lifted her head and looked at the door, and saw fingers sliding through the narrow gap between the door and the frame and rattling the door. Though it was dark, she could still make out that they were fingers from how they moved. The white, skinny, long fingers gave her chills. Could this be yet another night terror, she thought? And then, with a thud, the hand dropped on the floor. It wasn't even a full hand, but cut off somewhere between the wrist and fingers. Grandma panicked and crawled back to the wall. She says she still can't forget the sound of the hand wiggling across the floor. It then crawled up Grandma's leg. It was colder than the stream in the midwinter day. Grandma was just frozen, stuck with fear, while the hand crawled up all the way to her throat and started to strangle.
Mom! Mom!
When Grandma woke up from her daughter's shaking her, it was already afternoon. Grandma just grabbed confused Mom in her arms and bursted into tears. It was just a dream, just a nightmare. Nevertheless, she was alarmed enough and started packing up right there and then. She couldn't bear the thought that her daughter might be also the subject of such a terror. But then Mom asked Grandma,
Mom, what's that on your neck? It's all black and blue. Did somebody hit you?
Grandma was startled and looked into the mirror, and indeed, around her neck was clear bruise, as if somebody strangled her indeed. She was later told by the abbot of the temple that not only the visitors and staffs, but even some newbie monks would experience such a terror. Grandma took a loan from a relative and found a cheap room in Seoul for her and her daughter. I lost my dad when I was 7. After Dad passed away, Mom went to live at a Buddhist temple in Chungcheong province for 3 years, cleaning and cooking for monks there. For little me, it was like losing both my parents. Fortunately, my 2 older sisters and my grandma took good care of me, but I didn't understand why Mom chose to live away from me and at a temple of all places. Only later I learned that the shaman's fate runs in my family, and it was a desperate choice on my mom's part to suppress the fate. Anyway, I spent my vacations at the temple for that reason, and did get acquainted with some female monks there too. In later years, one of them moved out and built her own little temple up in the mountain near a little village. Even as a monk who believes and lives in the grace of Buddha, it was a bit creepy to start a new life alone in the mountain. And besides, she couldn't yet decide where to set the shrine to the deity of the mountain. It's one aspect where the local shamanism melted into Buddhism. Since most Buddhist temples are in the mountains, they do not forget to set up the shrine dedicated to the guardian god of the mountain in honor of the local deity. So, by and by, the monk asked for help from my mom, knowing well of my mom's spiritual ability. On the second night there, Mom noticed noises from the outside, something like bowls and dishes clattering. Mom peeped out through the window. Right at the front of the temple was a well, and they usually left a bowl of rice and clean water as offering. And there, a man was gobbling down rice with his bare hand. Mom thought he must be a desperate beggar, came all this way for food, and left him alone. But following morning, Mom found the bowl of rice was still full. That night, Mom heard the same noises from the same spot, and indeed saw a man eating away the rice with bare hands again. When the same phenomenon continued for a week, Mom finally reported what she saw to the monk.
I saw it too,
the the monk said.
It's a hungry ghost, the soul of a person starved to death.
The monk noticed the ghost around from the beginning. No wonder she got scared when it dared to follow her here and there around the temple. There was a good reason why she called him my mom.
It doesn't mean to harm anybody. Just let it be,
was the monk's conclusion. From that day on, Mom finished every business before it got dark and didn't go out of her room. Then one night, Mom had a dream in which that hungry ghost guzzled down the rice with her bare hands again. His clothes were rags and face was all smudged like he didn't wash for a long time. But then from the mountain appeared an old man with white hair and in white cloak and yelled,
"You insolent brat! How dare you! Get away from here at once!"
His voice was so resonant that the whole mountain seemed to be shaking by it, and the hungry ghost ran away without a trace. Only then the old man turned around and went back into the mountain. Mom talked about the weird dream to the monk, and the monk's response was,
"Finally, we know where now."
And she built the shrine to the god of the mountain at the spot where the old man in my mom's dream disappeared too. It's already 15 years ago. I failed to enter the university I aimed for and was preparing to try another year. Now that I was no more a student, I had to find a way to establish the routine to focus and carry on with my study. The more usual option would have been signing up for a cram school, but I didn't like that idea. I decided rather to isolate myself in a Buddhist temple somewhere away from hustle and bustle and focus on my preparation. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had the same idea. I made a round call to famous temples up and down the country, but all of them were full. Then, one temple referred me to a small temple in Andong, and there they had just one room left. The temple was indeed so small that it was more like a chapel. There was just one monk residing, and apart from 3 women working and cooking, there were just 2 residents, guys preparing for tests just like myself. The older 30-year-old man was an artist, but upon his mom's wish for a steadier career for her son, he was now aiming to pass the test for a government office position. The younger 22-year-old was also preparing for a test for another type of government work position. On the first day, the 30-year-old guy showed me around the place and said it was a certain serendipity that I came to the temple. Before me, my room was occupied by a 30-something-year-old man who used to be an assistant to a famous actress. He was there to recover from illness, but nobody knew exactly what was wrong with him. He was overall funny and personable character, but he would occasionally make a weird comment. Pointing a big old tree in the courtyard, he'd say, "It's either me or that tree that dies first." And one quiet morning, people were woken up by the guy's scream and shouts. When they came out, he was digging around the big old tree. He even poured salt around it. In a few days since the incident, his health declined dramatically and died shortly afterwards back in hospital. And that was just 3 days prior I contacted the temple for a room. Frankly, I wasn't sure how to take the story. The resident monk was a 55-year-old man, and apparently famous for his high level of spirituality and insight. He was invited to take more important role in the Buddhist establishment, but rather chose to stay in this quiet little temple. Yet, people with various issues would come all the way up here, seeking help from the monk. 2 months passed at the temple, and I was well settled down with the routine there. One day, a minivan drove up to the temple. A middle-aged man and a woman got off the car. Turned out, the woman was possessed by a spirit and came here for a cleansing ritual by the monk. At first, I was more amused, but it soon turned to discomfort when I saw the other two guys, who were usually pretty machos, now reacting with panic. I guess they had already seen similar occasion and learned it was no light matter. The 22-year-old went back home, and the 30-year-old too wanted to do the same. It was easy for them because both of their homes were not far from the temple, but I hung on to him that he couldn't possibly leave me all alone. About 4 in the morning, the monk appeared in a bright-colored robe that was worn only for a special occasion, and ritual symbols in his hand. He simply instructed that I should cut the power to the entire temple when he later gave me the signal. And though I'd also better to keep my shoes inside the room, he added. More details I could learn from the 30-year-old guy. When the cleansing ritual reaches the high point to expel the parasitic spirit, there shouldn't be a single light around. After the expulsion, now the freed woman would stay in the main hall for the rest of the night, where the spirit wouldn't dare to approach. But the spirit wouldn't easily give up. It would use all the tricks and threat to persuade the former host to open the door. If the woman should give in and open the door, she would be forever taken by the spirit. When that tactic should fail, the spirit would now be out to look for a new host. That's the reason why we were told to hide our shoes. I was creeped out, if I wasn't already. I couldn't stand being alone, that I stayed in the 30-year-old's room together. From the early evening, chants and ringing of cymbals rang for hours on till the dusk set. About at 8 o'clock, the monk shouted to cut the power quickly. I'm ashamed to admit that I was too scared to take up the task. It was the 30-year-old guy who did the job in the end. In the pitch dark, all we could hear was the continuing chants from the monk. About 10 minutes later, he shouted once again, this time to turn back on the power. He said the ritual was over now, but we should go to bed early and stay in our room that night. I was still so tense that I wanted to stay with the 30-year-old, but he kicked me out to my room. I put the door latch on and tried to calm down reading a magazine. Suddenly, I felt chills. The floor was scorching hot, and yet I felt cold. I wanted to jump up and run to the 30-year-old, but I could already hear him snoring away carefreely. I lied down myself, praying that I could fall asleep quickly too. But chills got only worse with the undeniable sense of something approaching. I'm not a follower of any particular religion, but my high school was a Christian mission school, and I could recite Lord's Prayer and other well-known prayers. Never expected that it could come to use in this type of situation, but I started reciting prayers in my mind, and it seemed to calm me down enough to doze off finally. But another intense sense of impending danger woke me up before long. Above all, I felt cold. Chills ran up and down my spine, and the oppressing sense of something standing right outside my door. I hurriedly resumed reciting prayers, but I wasn't ready for what happened next. My body lifted up all by itself like Dracula waking up stiff straight out of his coffin. I went breathless with panic. Words of prayers broke and disappeared from my lips. Now my body was lifted up by 30 degrees or so. Physical pain overwhelmed me as if all my joints were twisted and misplaced. Desperately, I tried to think of the prayer word by word. All the while, my body was kept lifting up, now almost facing the room door. And when I barely managed to think of a full sentence of the prayer, my mouth opened up by itself, and from it shoot out a weird chant in the language I didn't understand and in the speed unthinkable. I spoke so fast that my tongue and lips almost buzzed like a mobile phone. And after a flashing second of that intense chant, my body fell back down to bed. Was that it? Was I free now? Aching pain was gone, and so was the chill. I lifted my head to look at the door, and was shocked to find the paper on the door turned all yellow rag as if it was paper a decade ago. And the latched locked door was now crack opened, and I could see the stars outside. Before I could react or indeed could think of anything, a tornado-like wind swept through and out of the room. It was so fierce I had to grab onto the desk and the door frame not to get blown out with it. After the second of storm came the silence, as if nothing had happened. The guy next room was still snoring, and the clock in the kitchen hit 4. After breakfast, I went to see the monk. Before I said anything, he said,
"It was pretty scary last night, wasn't it?"
and handed over an envelope. Inside was 2 months' worth of rent. He knew. I came to tell him that I was leaving. He even gave me a lift to the express bus terminal. He told me to take it easy with my study and aim for the next year. And just as he predicted, I managed to enter my dream university only in the 3rd year. I never returned to the temple, but I wonder what happened of it and the monk. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If these stories have in any way spiked your interest in Buddhism in Korea, and if you happen to have an opportunity to visit Korea, some temples do offer for visitors to stay and immerse themselves in the atmosphere and experience traditional Buddhist cuisine. Modern Korea is incredibly busy and hectic. Temple stay program would be a great opportunity to experience the different side, more Zen tradition of Korea. If you enjoyed my work, please leave it a comment and a like, and please consider subscribing to my channel. If you'd support me more directly, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link's in the description. Buy Me a Coffee supporters enjoy an early access to my new video. Thank you. I'll come back with something different next Sunday. Stay safe and take care.